The first time I saw her, she was standing alone by a gate that didn't want her. Wind tugged at her dress, dust climbed her shoes, and everything she owned lay tipped in the dirt like someone had shaken her life loose and walked away. Late sunlight stretched long across the prairie, turning the world gold, but nothing about that moment felt warm. Not the quiet, not the sky, not the way she held a crumpled letter, the way a person holds a wound they can't hide anymore. I remember thinking no one should ever look that discarded, and I remember how she looked back at me, half afraid, half daring someone to see her. What I didn't know then was that stopping my horse would change both our lives, and the shape of this lonely stretch of Dakota forever. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. Late afternoon light stretched long across the Dakota plain, the kind of gold that made every dust mote glow as it drifted through the heat. Eli Mercer rode with his back straight and quiet, a small stack of supplies tied behind his saddle coffee, lamp oil, a few bolts for fence repairs. Nothing special, just the load of a man who lived alone and didn't expect much more from the world. The road toward his ranch ran beside a line of cottonwoods, their leaves clicking in the dry wind. Far off, thunderheads piled up like bruises along the horizon. He figured they'd pass north, as most storms did this time of year. Still, he kept an eye on them. A man who'd learned weather the hard way rarely stopped paying attention. The gate to the Kincaid spread rows ahead tall timber posts, iron hinges polished to a shine, and a sign big enough to read from half a mile out, Kincaid Cattle Company. Boyd Kincaid liked things large and loud, including his own name. Eli, by contrast, preferred a ranch that didn't announce itself. His place down the road was smaller, older, patched in spots, but honest. As he rode closer, something caught his eye movement by the gate. A freight wagon sat at an awkward angle, one wheel half in a rut. The driver stood beside it, hands on hips, arguing with someone he couldn't see yet. The voices carried thin in the wind. Eli slowed his gelding to a walk. A young woman stood at the side of the road, close to the gate, but not inside it. Her traveling dress, once tidy and fine, had lost the shine of the rails and trails. Dust clung to the hem. Her trunk lay tipped on its side behind her, its lid sprung open, and a spill of clothing half buried in the dirt. She knelt, gathering them with shaking hands, trying to fold pieces that didn't want folding anymore. Her face was blotched from crying, though she held her chin tight, as if daring the world to say something about it. She clutched a letter, creased, crumpled, and clenched so hard the paper edges bent around her fingers. The freight driver muttered curses into the air. "Look, miss, I just hauled you here same as I was paid to do, but he ain't taking you. Says you're not what he ordered. Says he'll send the money for your train home if you want it. That's the end of it." The woman blinked at him slowly, as if she'd been hit too many times today to react properly. She opened her mouth, then closed it, pressing her lips together to keep from trembling. Eli stayed where he was for a moment, reins slack in his hand. This wasn't his business. Boyd Kincaid's dealings never were. Folks who got tangled in the Kincaid family's affairs often regretted it. And a mail-order bride was a private matter, an arrangement folks entered into for their own reasons. Some found happiness. Some didn't. It wasn't Eli's place to step between them, but the scene stuck under his ribs. A woman cast off at a gate like a crate returned by mistake, a trunk overturned, her life scattered in dust. Heat shimmered around her like a punishment laid down by the land itself. The freight driver pointed toward Red Creek, Stage leaves in the mornin'. You can ride back with me. That's the best I can tell you. She nodded stiffly, though the nod looked like something done for dignity, not agreement. Eli nudged his horse a few steps closer. Kincaid's not taking you, he asked quietly. The driver threw up his hands, refused, said she ain't what he expected, said her appearance was misrepresented, said her past was questionable. The woman flinched at that word, questionable, as if it had been used on her before. Eli felt something in his jaw tighten. Boyd Kincaid was a man who enjoyed power the way some men enjoyed whiskey too much, too often, and without care for the wreckage left behind. But this, leaving a woman out here at the gate, no escort, no lodging, no dignity that was low even for him. He turned away slightly, trying to talk himself down. This wasn't his concern. He had no business meddling. A man living quiet shouldn't go looking for storms, but he kept seeing her hands trembling, gathering each piece of clothing with a kind of carefulness only the humiliated know. A voice inside him, the one he'd tried to keep still for years, whispered, "If you ride past, you're no better than the man who threw her out." He exhaled through his nose, slow. Then he pulled the reins and swung down from the saddle. Boots in the dust. He walked toward her. The woman stiffened, like she expected another judgment. The driver looked relieved simply to have someone else near. Eli spoke gently, removing his hat as he approached. "Ma'am," he said, "forgive the intrusion. I couldn't help overhearin'." She kept her eyes low. "There's nothing to overhear. Mr. Kincaid has decided he wants nothing to do with me." Her voice carried a brittle edge, but underneath it lived hurt so sharp, Eli felt it in his own chest. He glanced at the freight driver. "She got anywhere else to go back east, I reckon," the driver replied, "or the boarding house in Red Creek, till she figures what's next." Eli nodded once, like a man committing to something he hadn't planned. He turned to her fully. "Ma'am, if you've got nowhere else to go, my place is 5 miles down this road." She looked up then, eyes rimmed red, suspicion and exhaustion fighting in them. "I'm not asking anything of you," Eli continued, "just offering a roof. I've got a spare room. It ain't much, but it's dry. You can stay there until you decide your next step. No expectations, no obligations." The freight driver blinked. Surprised? The woman just stared. Eli kept his tone steady, respectful. "I don't mean to meddle, and you don't owe me a thing, but I can't ride past and leave you standing here like this." The woman swallowed, her throat working as she tried to find her voice. Why she whispered. Eli glanced up at the Kincaid gate, then back at her. "Because what happened here ain't right, and because no one ought to be left in the dust, because another person changed his mind." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Wind tugged at her hair. Shadows lengthened under the wheels of the freight wagon. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried over the plains. Her fingers loosened around the crumpled letter. A tiny flicker so small it might have been imagined, lit in her eyes. Not trust. Not yet. But the faintest hint of hope, fighting to breathe. 5 miles, she asked softly. 5. Eli confirmed. "Easy ride. We'll go slow." She looked at her overturned trunk, at the road stretching east, at the empty gate behind her, then back at him. Her silence felt like a held breath, like the whole prairie waiting on her answer. And when she finally gave the smallest nod, Eli felt the world shift, just a little quiet. But sure. He lifted her trunk onto the wagon, careful with every piece that had fallen into the dust. The sun dipped lower. Something new, unsteady, uncertain, quietly dangerous took its place between them. The road to Eli's ranch stretched wide and empty before them, a ribbon of dirt softening under the evening light. The wagon creaked with each slow turn of its wheels. Lila Hart sat beside Eli on the wooden bench, holding herself as if the air might shatter her if she shifted too quickly. The crumpled letter lay in her lap, edges torn from how many times she'd folded and unfolded it. She kept one hand on it, the way a person keeps a hand on a wound, pressing down to stop something unseen from spilling out. Eli guided the team with quiet hands, giving her space. He wasn't good with conversation on the best days, and this wasn't one of them, but silence felt too sharp, so after a while he spoke not to pry, just to fill the wind between them. "You come from far?" he asked gently. She nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Lowell, Massachusetts. That's a long haul," he said. "Factory town, isn't it? Textile mills. Mostly." Her voice was soft as worn muslin. "I worked there when I was younger. Loom work, later, sewing." She didn't explain further, didn't need to. He'd seen enough mill girls in his youth to know the toll those rooms took, the dust, the noise, the hours that ate a person thin from the inside. Eli waited, letting her decide if she wanted to say more. Finally, she added, "Things went bad. Back east. Kincaid's advertisement looked like a way forward." Her fingers tightened around the paper. "I thought maybe a new start would be enough." Eli nodded. He understood the hunger for a beginning that didn't hurt. The wagon rattled through a shallow dip in the road, the kind that filled with mud in spring but lay dry now, cracked and pale. A windmill poked up faintly in the distance. The first sign of his place, its blades turned slow, creaking against the wind. "That's mine," he said quietly. Lila looked up. The modest ranch appeared gradually, like something the land had tried to hide, a weathered cabin. Its roof long sun-bleached, a small barn leaning a touch to the left, a pair of sheds made from mismatched lumber, a rope corral, a clothesline with 2 shirts flapping like tired flags. Nothing proud, nothing boastful, just lived in. As they pulled closer, she took in more of it, the rough-hewn porch posts, the little patch of earth near the steps where something green had once tried to grow, and the tin tub propped outside to catch rainwater. She seemed to study each part with the care of someone mapping unfamiliar territory. "This isn't much," Eli said, almost apologetic. "It's honest," she replied, surprising him. "That counts." He tied the horses to the hitch rail and climbed down, then offered her a hand. She hesitated before taking it, not out of distrust, but from the memory of too much disappointment. Her grip was light, cautious. Inside, the cabin greeted them with the faint scent of coffee grounds and smoke that had settled into the walls over years. The main room held a cast-iron stove, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, shelves stacked with jars and tins, and a narrow window whose sill was cluttered with books, novels, a Bible, a few volumes of poetry, and a dog-eared book on horsemanship. Lila paused, taking it all in. Something softened in her posture, as if the room's humble warmth touched a place in her she hadn't realized was still tender. Eli motioned toward a small door off to the right. "I keep a spare room. Was my brother's when he came through working cattle a few years back." He opened the door slowly, letting her step inside first. The room held a simple bed with a quilt folded neatly on top, a small dresser scarred with water rings, and a single window that faced the fields. Dust motes drifted in the evening sunbeam, unhurried. "You can lock it from inside." Eli said. I won't come in unless you ask. Her hand hovered near the doorknob, brushing the faint scratch marks left from old hinges. She nodded, almost a bow. And I sleep down the hall, he added, pointing to another small room. If you need anything, knock. Otherwise, I'll keep out of your way. Leila stepped back into the main room with him. Her trunk was still on the porch, and Eli went to fetch it. She tried to help, but he shook his head. It's all right. You've had enough weight on you today. When he brought it inside, they sat at the kitchen table. Eli lit a small oil lamp, its glow softening the lines of their faces. The night pressing against the window felt easier with that small circle of light between them. Eli cleared his throat. Reckon we ought to lay out how this works, just so you feel set. She straightened, a flicker of pride lifting her shoulders. I won't stay long, just enough to decide what to do next. I can work. I always have. I know, he said, and I'm not asking anything else. You stay until you choose your next step. No one here will push you toward a decision. She looked down at her hands, resting lightly on the letter. In exchange, you help with what you're comfortable with. Cookin', housekeeping, maybe learn a few ranch jobs if you want. Not required. She nodded, breathing steadier. And, Eli added carefully, there's no promise of marriage, no obligation, just room and board for honest work. Her gaze lingered on him, studying his face for any hint of hidden cost. She found none. For a long while, neither spoke. The lamp flickered, catching the curve of her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, the fight still trembling in her. Then she folded the rejection letter slowly, precisely flattening its creases, as if sealing away something painful. She placed it into her trunk and shut the lid. I'll work, she said softly. I won't be your burden, Mr. Mercer. Eli inclined his head, one hand closing gently around his coffee cup. Then we'll call it even, Miss Hart. The words settled between them like dust in lamplight quiet, small, but solid. Outside, the windmill creaked again, steady as a heartbeat. Inside, two strangers sat in the soft glow of an oil lamp, each aware that something had shifted, though neither dared name it yet. The house, long silent, seemed to listen, and as the night deepened around them, a fragile truce took its first breath. Leila woke to the quiet sound of morning no trains, no shouting foremen, no rattling mill looms, just wind brushing against the cabin walls and the faint pop of cooling embers in the stove. The air carried the smell of coffee and bacon, warm and familiar, drifting in from the kitchen like an invitation. Half dreaming, she sat up and let her eyes adjust. Sunlight spilled through the small window, painting a soft bar of gold across the quilt. At the foot of the bed lay a folded piece of paper in Eli's careful, blocky handwriting. Gone to check south pasture. Help yourself. E. The note was simple, almost shy, but something in its tone, plain courtesy, no expectations settled her nerves in a way she wasn't prepared for. She washed her face, tied her hair back, and stepped into the main room. The first thing she noticed was the dust. It lay in corners and under chairs, like something that had settled over months, maybe years. Dishes waited in the wash basin. Someone's shirt, Eli's, no doubt hung over the back of a chair. Boots by the hearth sat in the exact shape of a man's daily life, unmoved unless absolutely necessary. She walked a slow circle around the room. There was nothing elegant about the place, but it felt lived in, steady, safe. On a shelf near the window, she found a handful of books, cheap dime novels with frayed covers. A leather Bible softened by years of handling, a volume of poems by Longfellow, and a thin, battered journal with a cavalry emblem on the front. She touched its worn edges but didn't open it. Some things were better left to those who owned them. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. This house forgot how to breathe, she murmured to herself. It had the look of a place used only for sleeping and eating, not for living. She knew that kind of space intimately. She set her hands on her hips, rolled up her sleeves, and opened the windows one by one. Prairie air rushed and sharp, clean, carrying the smell of grass and distant dust. It lifted the curtains like wings waking from stillness. She felt her own chest rise a little wider with each breath. Then she got to work. She scrubbed the table with a wet cloth, rubbing until the wood grain shone through the dull layer left by time. She stacked dishes, swept the floor, and gathered Eli's shirts into a neat pile on his bed. She even found a broom tucked behind the stove, the handle worn, smooth, and used it to chase crumbs and dirt out the open door. After that, she stepped outside, behind the cabin, where the earth dipped slightly before meeting the fence line. She found a patch of ground that looked abandoned, half weeds, half potential. Someone, long ago, might have planted something there. She knelt and began pulling dead stems, sorting stones, turning soil with her gloved hands. It felt good, simple, steadying. A place wasn't truly yours until you'd touched its dirt. While she worked, Eli rode under the wide sky miles away. His horse moved at a steady trot along the south pasture fence line, ears flicking at the brush of grasshoppers. Eli scanned for strays, eyes narrowed in the bright sun. But no matter how he tried to keep his mind on the land, it circled back to the woman in his spare room. He'd brought strangers home before drifters, ranch hands down on their luck, an old friend passing through, but never like this. Never a woman with a life's worth of bruised pride and silent hurt packed behind her eyes. He wondered what she thought of his place. Too small, too lonely, too broken down to offer comfort. He nudged his horse onward, but the question stuck. By the time Eli turned down his own lane at noon, the sun was high and hot. He wiped his brow, expecting to see the same tired porch he'd left that morning. Instead, he felt a jolt. The windows were open, curtains fluttering. Dust that once coated the steps was swept clean, and from inside came the smell of something cooking stew. Maybe with onions and a hint of thyme. He blinked once, then twice, as though he'd stumbled onto someone else's home by mistake. Inside, Lila was standing at the stove, stirring a pot with one hand and tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with the other. A soft flush touched her cheeks from the heat. "Oh, Mr. Mercer, I hope you don't mind. I didn't mean to change things too much." Her voice trembled slightly, the fear of overstepping still near the surface. "I just thought it could use a bit of tidying." Eli looked around. Clean floor, organized shelves, sunlight turning the room warm instead of dim. It felt strange. Seeing the cabin alive again. Strange, but not unwelcome. He removed his hat and set it on a peg. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. "But I'm not complaining." The stew simmered. They sat for lunch, 2 bowls, 2 spoons, quiet between them that wasn't uncomfortable. When a sudden bang echoed across the yard, a barn door caught by a gust of wind. Lila flinched so sharply she nearly dropped her spoon. Her breath hitched, eyes darting to the window, as if waiting for something worse. "Sorry," she whispered. "I don't mean to be jumpy." "You're fine," Eli said softly. She looked around the clean room and rushed to explain herself. words tumbling fast. I shouldn't have moved things. I know it's your home. I just couldn't sit still. And the air felt heavy, and I thought maybe Lila. His voice stopped her gently. Eli leaned back in his chair, studying the room the way a man studies a field he hasn't walked in years. This house has been too quiet for too long, he said. It breathes better this way. Lila stared at him, waiting to see if he meant it. The truth in his eyes settled her more than the words. And then, for the first time since she'd arrived at his gate, a small, unguarded smile touched her lips. It wasn't bright or easy, but it was real. Something loosened in Eli's chest. Outside, the windmill turned once, groaned, then found its rhythm again slow, steady, like a home taking its first true breath in years. A week passed before Eli suggested they ride into Red Creek for supplies. Hurry. The morning was pale and brisk, sunlight barely warming the frost on the grass as they loaded the wagon. Lila folded her hands in her lap, hiding the small tremor in her fingers. She had lived long enough around whispers to know what they did in towns like this. The wrong story could take root in an hour and last years. Eli noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, but didn't press. He simply said, "Won't be long. Just a few things we're running low on." She nodded, though her breathing stayed shallow. The wagon clattered into Red Creek mid-morning, passing the livery stable, first horses stomping, dust kicking up around their hooves. The blacksmith's forge rang with the sound of hammer on iron, sparks scattering like fireflies in daylight. The Silver Spur Saloon stood where it always did, its swinging doors flapping lazily as a pair of cowhands stepped out, already drunk. Beyond that rose the whitewashed church, and further up the slope, the flag at the army outpost hung still in the stiffening breeze. Everything looked normal. But Lila felt eyes on her long before they reached the general store. Eli tied the team outside and offered her a quiet nod. "Ready as I'll ever be," she murmured. Inside, the bell on the door jingled. Mr. Dalton, the storekeeper, glanced up from a stack of ledger books. His round face split into a polite, cautious smile. "Mornin', Eli. Brought company today. I see." His eyes slid toward Lila just a second too long. He wasn't unkind, but the look said, "I've heard things." The same look she'd seen in boarding houses and factory rooms back east. It always stung. Eli greeted him, asked about flour and nails, then turned to the shelves. Lila drifted toward the fabric bolts, touching the cloth lightly. Familiar, comforting work. Maybe if she kept her head down, the door jingled again. 3 women entered: Mrs. Carter, whose husband ran the blacksmith's forge, Mrs. Avery, a rancher's wife known for her sharp tongue, and her sister, a thin woman with a permanently disapproving squint. They were dressed neat, their hands gloved, their eyes already sweeping. Lila felt their attention land on her. First a smirk, then the recognition, then the whispering. "Mrs." Avery approached with the slow confidence of someone who enjoyed cornering prey. "Well, if it isn't Miss Hart, is it?" she asked sweetly. "We heard you'd arrived." Lila straightened her shoulders. "Yes, ma'am." "I suppose we all expected you'd be settling over at Kincaid's place," Mrs. Carter added, her voice coated in false sympathy. "Such a shame things didn't work out." The other woman leaned closer, voice dropping to a cutting whisper. "Some folks say you weren't entirely honest with that arrangement, that you misstated things." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Lila kept her face still. "I was engaged to Mr. Kincaid. He broke that engagement. That is all." The women exchanged looks, amused, superior. Mrs. Avery let out a sharp little laugh. Men don't send a bride back for nothing. Dear. The word struck Lila in a place she fought daily to protect. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, her breath catching. Not again. Not here. She turned slightly, intending to step away. But the aisle was narrow, and the women pressed closer, enjoying the corner they'd built around her. That was when she heard footsteps behind her. Eli. He had paused mid-aisle, a sack of flour on his shoulder, and had heard enough. His expression wasn't angry, not the kind that cracked like thunder. No, it was the quiet sort, the kind that spoke of a line crossed. He shifted the flour to one hand, stepped between Lila and the women, and looked each of them in the eye. "Afternoon, ladies," he said politely, though his voice carried iron. "Something wrong, Mrs." Avery sniffed, lifting her chin. "We were simply asking Miss Hart a few questions. A woman ought to know the company she keeps." Eli didn't blink. "Then, you ought to know, she's my guest." A hush fell around them. Even Dalton stopped writing. "She lives under my roof," Eli continued, "and she works for her keep as honest as any person in this town. So, if you're speaking against her character, you're speaking against mine." The silence deepened. The women's expressions tightened, not with shame, but irritation at being challenged. Then, as if summoned by the weight of his own lies, Boyd Kincaid stepped from the back of the store. He carried himself with the swagger of a man used to being admired. His boots were polished, his shirt freshly laundered. He smiled broadly, too broadly. Well, he drawled, "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon. Miss Hart?" Lila froze. Kincaid tipped his hat with theatrically sincere politeness. "I was just explaining to a few folks that there were discrepancies in your letters. I chose to err on the side of virtue." He sighed, as though the weight of being moral carved a heaviness in his chest. Hard decisions must be made by men of responsibility. Lila's hands balled at her sides, her jaw tightened. Eli set down the flour with slow, deliberate care. "Boyd," he said quietly, "you left a woman at your gate like she was a broken crate." Kincaid blinked, thrown off by the calmness of the words. "That ain't virtue," Eli continued, voice low but clear enough for the entire store to hear. "That's just bad stockmanship." The room went still. Even the dust seemed to stop floating. Kincaid's mouth opened, then shut, the practiced speeches dying on his tongue. The women backed away, suddenly unsure. Dalton cleared his throat and busied himself with his ledger again. Though his ears burned red, Lila stood behind Eli, her breath trembling, her heart pounding like hooves against dry earth. For the first time since arriving in Dakota territory, someone had stood between her and the world, and not because he had to, because he chose to. The moment held, suspended in quiet. Kincaid straightened his hat, forced a thin smile, and walked out his boots, clipping too sharply on the floor. Eli didn't watch him go. He turned to Lila instead. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, but her eyes shimmered, and she looked away quickly. The bell jingled as another customer entered, breaking the spell. Eli picked up the flour and walked to the counter, but she could still feel the echo of his words rooted in the air. Outside, the wind stirred dust across the street, carrying with it the first murmur of a new reputation, one that didn't belong to Kincaid anymore. The ride home from Red Creek was quieter than usual. The sun had dipped low, staining the sky in muted oranges and violets, yet the colors seemed to slide off Lila's face without leaving warmth. She sat with her shoulders tight, hands clenched in her lap, staring straight ahead as the wagon rocked beneath them. The words from the store had traveled home with them, like thorns caught in cloth. Eli kept his eyes on the road, giving her space. He didn't speak, not even to comment on the weather or the coming week's chores. He had the sense that anything he said too soon might shatter the fragile hold she had on herself. When they reached the ranch, the windmill caught the last light, its shadow stretching long over the ground. Lila climbed down before the wagon even stopped fully, moving quickly, as though walking faster might leave the memory of town behind. Inside the cabin, she lit the lamp with shaking hands. Eli heard the faint scrape of the match. He stepped inside a moment later, removing his hat slowly. "Lila," he said softly. She didn't turn. She stood with both hands gripping the back of a chair, her breath shallow. The lamplight trembled across her knuckles. "I don't care what they think," she said suddenly, her voice sharper than she intended. "I shouldn't. They're strangers. They don't know me." But the way she blinked fast told another truth. Eli set his hat on the peg. "No, they don't." She swallowed, but it still gets inside. Even after everything. Her words cracked on that last note, thin as thread pulled too tight. Eli stepped one pace closer, enough to be near, not enough to crowd her. "You want to talk?" he asked quietly. "You don't have to. But if you want it off your chest, I'm here." She stared at the chair a moment longer, then sank slowly into it. The tension in her shoulders eased, just barely. "Maybe," she whispered, "maybe I should tell you something. You deserve to know what they were dancing around." Eli poured her a cup of warm water, set it before her without comment, then sat across the table, his hands folded. Lila stared into the lamplight as though reading her own past in its flicker. "I grew up on a small farm in New England," she began. "Hard winters, thin soil. My parents did what they could, but there wasn't much for a girl to inherit except calluses." She tried to smile. It barely held. "When I turned 14, I went to Lowell to work in the mills. Most girls did. 30 looms in one room. You couldn't hear yourself think. Lung full of lint by noon." She touched her throat lightly, remembering the scratch of dust and heat. "I stayed because it paid, and because I wanted something better." Her eyes drifted downward. There was a foreman's son there. Charming in the way men get when they know they don't have to be. "He courted me, promised a ring, borrowed money from me during a slow season, my savings from years of work." She paused. "Then he vanished." Eli said nothing. His face stayed calm, watching her with a patience that steadied her. "When I went to his father to ask for the money back, the story changed. Suddenly I wasn't a girl he'd courted. I was a girl who had made suggestions, improper ones." Her voice tightened. They never said it outright. They just let the rumor grow on its own. She folded her hands tightly to keep them from shaking. In a boarding house, gossip grows like mold. It gets into everything, even when it isn't true. She took a long breath, staring at a knot in the wood of the table. "I left the mill and took work as a seamstress in a big house. But the story followed me. People would whisper as soon as I entered a room. Or worse, they'd stop whispering." She let that sit in the quiet air. "When I saw Kincaid's advertisement, I thought, maybe distance was the cure. Maybe if I went far enough, started fresh enough, the past wouldn't cling so tight." She gave a short, bitter laugh. I wrote to him, honestly. I told him what work I'd done, that I had no fortune, no dowry. I didn't mention the rumors. I thought she looked up at Eli, eyes shimmering. I thought that if I was good enough, useful enough, it wouldn't matter what had been said about me. She reached into her trunk beside the table, pulling out a small ribbon-bound bundle, the letters she'd exchanged with Boyd Kincaid. She placed them on the table. Eli touched the top letter gently, as if it might crumble. The handwriting was neat, stiff, precise, no warmth, no curiosity. He never once asked about me. She said, "Not really." He wrote about cattle prices, weather, how many rooms his house had, but never about me. Lila pressed her palm to her chest, as if holding back a hurt. I thought I could make myself useful enough to be welcome. Her voice cracked, but he decided my past mattered more. Eli lifted his gaze to hers, steady as a fence post in hard ground. "What a man like that decides," he said, quietly, "doesn't make you any less true." The room fell still. Not heavy, not sharp, just still like a pause the heart takes before beating again. Lila breathed in slowly. Something inside her shifted, faint but real, like a knot loosening. But in her eyes, a shadow remained some deeper part of the story she hadn't spoken yet. She looked away. Eli noticed, but didn't press. Outside, night settled over the prairie, cicadas humming in the dark. Leela wound the ribbon back around the letters, her movements careful, thoughtful. When she set the bundle aside, her hand lingered a moment too long. Something unspoken trembled there. Lila had been avoiding the windows since the night she told Eli about Lowell. Something in her posture had eased. Yes, but the deeper shadows still lived behind her ribs. Eli noticed. He noticed everything. And one morning, when she was kneading dough at the table, he looked up from oiling his saddle and said, almost casually, "You ever ridden outside a wagon?" She blinked. "A handful of times. Nothing. Serious." He closed the tin of oil, wiped his hands on a cloth, and nodded toward the door. "Come on." Then, "Time you learned the north fence line." She hesitated only a breath. Then she untied her apron, hung it neatly on its nail, and followed him into the morning light. The gelding Eli chose for her was a mild-mannered red roan with patient eyes. Lila ran a cautious hand down its neck, feeling the animal's warmth under her palm. "He reads you more than you read him," Eli said, adjusting the stirrup. "Treat him steady, and he'll carry you through a storm." She managed a small smile. "Let's hope I don't test that today." He helped her mount, carefully, politely, hands guiding only when needed. She sat stiffly at first, but as the horse shifted under her with a slow, forgiving rhythm, her posture softened. They rode side by side along the road. As they passed the blacksmith shop, sparks flew from the anvil in bright bursts. The air smelled of iron and sweat. Further on, an army patrol trotted by a sergeant tipping his hat, soldiers riding with dusty uniforms and faces half-baked in the sun. Lila's shoulders tensed, but Eli kept a calm pace, letting her feel the normalcy of it. A little farther still. They passed a weathered wooden cross planted beside the road. Wildflowers had grown around its base. "A wagon overturned there," Eli said quietly. "2 winters back." Lila bowed her head for a moment. Some losses didn't need words to be honored. Once they reached open range, the land spread before them rolling grass, scattered cottonwoods, and the faint metallic glint of the long fence stretching north. Lila inhaled deeply. "It feels different out here." "Bigger?" Eli asked. "Alive," she said. Eli led her along the fence, pointing out where wire sagged, where posts leaned. He showed her how to check tension, by plucking a strand, how the right note meant the wire wasn't too loose or too tight. She tried it, brow furrowed in concentration, and he nodded approvingly. Good. She looked surprised by his praise. They worked steadily, setting a new post, tightening sagging wire. Lila's hands blistered, but she didn't complain. Sweat streaked the dust on her face, and her hair escaped its pins in soft wisps between tasks. Their talking deepened, the kind of talk that came easier under open sky. Eli told her about the war, about being a cavalry scout, riding through gray mornings with frost on his beard, tracking Confederate riders through thick woods. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. His voice stayed quiet, like someone speaking to a grave. I lost the taste for killing, he said simply. Didn't figure I ever really had it, but war teaches you things you don't forget, things you wish you could. He paused, glancing at the horizon. Back in Ohio, I was engaged before the war. Thought I'd come home to a wedding, but a bad winter campaign put me out of touch for months. Letters stopped. She married someone else. He shrugged, not with bitterness, just resignation. Life moves on, even when you're not there to move with it. Lila didn't answer, but the way she looked at him, soft, steady, said she understood more than words could show. Clouds were building to the west by then. Dark ones, thick as stacked iron. The wind shifted, cooler, carrying the scent of rain. We should head back, Lila said, uneasy. Maybe so? Eli agreed. But we got a bit more fence here. A distant rumble cut him off. The cattle in a nearby wash bellowed uneasily. A sudden flash tore across the clouds, white and violent. The roan beneath Lila sidestepped, ears pinned back. Lightning cracked again, closer this time. The cattle panicked, shoving against the fence. One steer broke through, crashing into open range, headed straight toward a ravine to the north. Eli reacted instantly. Stay with me. He spurred his horse and took off. Lila followed, clumsy at first, but determined. They split directions, Eli chasing the steer, Lila riding hard to cut off another weak point in the fence before more animals escaped. Wind whipped her hair, rain beginning to spit down in cold needles. The roan jumped forward under her urging, hooves pounding the earth. She reached the sagging section of fence and dismounted fast, heart hammering. Her fingers trembled on the wire. The sky above her darkened to bruised purple, a flash so bright she saw bones in her hands. The thunder hit immediately, a violent crack that shook the ground. The roan screamed and reared. Lila lost her balance, and then Eli was there. He'd wheeled his horse around the moment he saw her stagger. He swung down in one motion and caught her by the upper arms, just as her boots slid in the mud. The storm crashed around them, lightning, wind, cattle bawling below the rocks. Rain pelted harder now, soaking their coats, running in cold rivulets down their faces. You all right? He shouted over the storm, hands steady on her elbows. Her breath came quick and sharp, but she nodded. Yes, yes. I think the roan nuzzled her shoulder anxiously. She steadied him with one shaking hand. Lightning cracked again, farther this time. Eli stayed close, chest rising and falling hard with adrenaline. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead. Their faces were inches apart. Lila let out a breathless, almost disbelieving laugh. This is what you call a quiet day on the ranch. Eli huffed a short laugh of his own, more relief than humor. Round here, that's about the size of it. The shared shock, the closeness, the storm raging, and the fence holding it all wove something tight and unspoken between them. The cattle settled, the rain slowed, but the air between them held a different kind of electricity now, Something alive, something new. 3 weeks after the storm, the prairie settled into a calm stretch of warm days and slow evenings. Grass shimmered in soft gold, horses swished their tails at lazy flies, and the world felt, if only for a moment, gentler than usual. It was a Saturday afternoon when Eli mentioned the Sunday service. "They're holding a picnic after," he said casually, while tightening a cinch strap. "Folks bring bread, pies, not much else to do around here on a quiet Sunday." Lila paused with a pail in her hands. She hadn't set foot in a church since leaving Massachusetts, back east. She'd sat in pews where women shifted away from her, where whispers floated like gnats above her head. Her heart gave a familiar pinch. But another part of her, the part that had laughed on horseback in the middle of a lightning storm, wanted something different. "Do you want me to come?" she asked. He didn't look up at first, just adjusted the strap. Thoughtful. "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't." She swallowed, nodded once. "All right, I'll come." Sunday morning dawned soft and clear. Lila wore her simplest dress, one she'd mended 3 times already. She pinned her hair neatly and pressed a hand to the fabric, smoothing it with nervous care. When they reached Red Creek, the whitewashed chapel stood open, sunlight catching the simple wooden cross on the roof. Voices drifted from inside, warm, layered, human. Lila hesitated on the step. "You all right?" Eli asked. "Just remembering." He extended his arm, not insistently, just offering. She took it and stepped in. The chapel smelled of pine boards, hymnals, and the faint sweetness of beeswax candles. Soldiers from the outpost stood near the back. "Mr. Dalton nodded, politely. The blacksmith and his wife settled into their usual pew. Even one of the saloon girls from the Spur sat near the front, wearing a modest dress and trying her best at a fresh start. No one said anything unkind. A few even smiled. During the hymn, Leela's voice came out thin at first, but by the second verse, she found a steadier note. She hadn't sung in years, not since the mills drowned out everything but machinery, but it felt good, like her lungs expanded in ways she'd forgotten. The sermon was simple mercy, judgment, the danger of letting gossip harden a heart. Lila kept her eyes lowered, but something in those words touched her sharply. After service, the congregation spilled outside for the picnic. Tables were set up under cottonwoods. Children ran in the grass. Women set out pies. Everything felt almost normal. Mrs. Carter gave Lila a cool, polite nod. Mrs. Avery avoided her entirely, but Mary Ellen, a young rancher's wife with bright eyes and a shy smile, stepped over with a dish in her hands. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. "I heard what happened in the store that day. My own sister got caught in gossip once. Folks forget. Words can bruise." She squeezed Lila's hand. "Thank you for standing your ground." Lila blinked, surprised. Gratitude warmed her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. For a few minutes, she almost believed she belonged among these people. Eli watched her from a distance, arms folded lightly, a small, satisfied softness in his eyes. Then a voice sliced through the air behind her. "Well," someone said loudly, "seems some folks just don't know when they've worn out their welcome." Lila stiffened. Ada Kincaid, Boyd's older sister, approached with her chin high and judgment sharpened like a whetted knife. Her friends trailed behind her, their smiles tight and eager for drama. Ada looked Lila up and down. Drift from man to man, ranch to ranch. I suppose some habits die hard. A few heads turned. Whispers followed like ripples across water. Lila felt her stomach drop. Her fingers trembled at her sides. The old shame rose up so fast it almost choked her. It was Lowell all over again. The factory floors, the boarding house whispers, the fear of being seen and dismissed in the same breath. She glanced toward Eli. He took a step forward, but she lifted a hand, barely asking him not to intervene. Not here. Not now. Not with so many eyes. I need some air, she whispered. She walked away before her legs failed her. The ride home was the longest since she'd arrived in Dakota territory. Eli held the reins loosely, glancing at her every so often. The silence between them wasn't peaceful this time. It was heavy, cluttered with words she didn't know how to speak. Halfway down the quiet dirt road, Lila exhaled shakily. I'll leave, she said, voice barely steady. I'll take the next train from Red Creek. I won't drag your name through this any longer. Eli didn't react at first, didn't turn his head. He just slowed the horses until the wagon came to a stop in the middle of the empty road. Wind swept across the prairie grasses. If you go because you're done here, Eli said quietly, eyes fixed straight ahead, that's your choice. Lila stared at him, breath caught. But don't you ever go because some coward with a sharp tongue told you you should. He finally turned to her, his expression calm, steady, unyielding. You've got as much right to stand on this dirt as any of us. The words settled deep, somewhere no one had ever aimed kindness before. Lila felt something shift inside her. Not healed, not whole, but moved. The horses stamped impatiently, waiting for the road to continue. But Lila wasn't ready yet. Not to go forward, not to go back. Just to sit there, caught between an old life and the first true choice she'd ever been offered. 3 days after the Sunday service, Red Creek stirred with the sound of horses and dust as the noon stagecoach rattled down the main road. Folks drifted toward the stop soldiers waiting on parcels, ranch wives hoping for letters, a few children chasing behind the coach as it pulled in with a hiss of brakes. Lila and Eli had come for supplies and fencing nails. She kept to his side, chin slightly tucked, the memory of Ada Kincaid's cruel words still lingering in her ribs. She didn't show it, but Eli could read the tightness in her shoulders. Mr. Dalton stepped from the store as the driver unloaded the mail sacks. Afternoon, folks, let's see what we've got. He rifled through envelopes, calling names, O'Rourke, Benson, Sutter. He paused. Letter for Miss Lila Hart. The sound of her name seemed to ring out louder than it should have. A few heads turned. Dalton lifted the envelope, squinting at its worn edges. Looks like it took the long way around, he muttered. Postmarked. Last year. Lila froze. Last year. Her hands felt suddenly cold. Eli stepped forward, accepting the envelope on her behalf. He placed it gently into her hands. You okay? She nodded, though her breath trembled on the way out. They finished their errands in silence. The letter sat in Lila's lap on the wagon ride home, its paper soft from much handling, corners bent, the ink a little blurred. It bore the mark of distance and mishap, like it had crossed half the world in the wrong direction before finding her. Back at the ranch, she didn't go inside immediately. She stood on the porch, staring at the slanted handwriting on the front, her father's name, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in over a year. Eli lingered by the hitch rail, giving her space. When she finally stepped into the cabin, she sat at the small kitchen table. Hands shaking, she slid a finger under the flap and opened it. The paper inside was creased 3 ways, yellowed at the folds. She unfolded it slowly. Her father's voice came to her in uneven lines written in the blunt, honest script of a farm man who'd never favored flowery words. My Lila, I heard about the trouble at the mill. Folks talk loud when they don't know a thing, and louder still when they think they do. I don't believe a word against you. I never did. Lila's breath caught. The room blurred for a moment. I'm ashamed I wasn't there when you needed someone to stand up for your good name. A father ought to protect his daughter better than I did. I tried to send money enough for you to travel someplace new, someplace kinder, but I fell ill through most of the summer. By the time I could stand proper again, the man at the post said you'd already left Lowell. She pressed a hand over her mouth, shoulders trembling. If I failed you, it wasn't for lack of love. Forgive an old man his weakness. Wherever you are, I pray you're somewhere folks see you for who you are, not for what was said. Your loving father, Jonathan Hart. When she finished reading, the letter fell into her lap. Her eyes filled so fast she couldn't blink the tears away. A small sound escaped her, a broken, breathless thing she hadn't meant to let out. Eli stepped inside, quietly. He didn't say a word. He just removed his hat and sat in the chair across from her, waiting with a patience that made her chest ache. For a long while, she cried, not the tight, shame-choked tears she'd swallowed for years, but something deeper, older, grief for what she'd carried, and for what she hadn't needed to carry at all. She wiped her eyes, then covered her face with both hands. I thought, her voice cracked. I thought even my own family believed the rumors. I thought I left because no one wanted me back. Eli's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened with quiet anger, anger not at her, but at a world that had taught her such things. Seems that wasn't the truth, he said softly. She nodded, tears dripping onto the letter. This must have been routed wrong, or maybe the landlady kept it. She never much liked me. She gave a bitter little laugh. I built my whole life on the idea that even my father turned his back. Her fingers traced the shaky handwriting. I've been living like I was already judged, she whispered. Eli didn't interrupt. Lila lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were red but clear, focused on something new. Maybe it's time I start living like I'm already forgiven. A gust of wind pushed against the cabin door, rattling it gently. Outside, clouds drifted across the sun, casting long shadows over the yard. Eli set his hat down on the table. That letter took its time getting here, he said. But maybe it came on the day you needed it most. She managed a small, trembling smile. It wasn't full, it wasn't steady, but it was real. As she folded the letter, smoothing its creased edges, something steadied inside her like a fence post, finally driven deep enough to hold. Eli stood and moved to check the stove, pretending not to notice the last tear that slipped down her cheek. Lila pressed the folded letter to her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt the faint but unmistakable shape of self-worth settling back into its rightful place. By late summer, the prairie grass took on the color of old straw, dry, brittle, and ready to burn if the sky so much as breathed wrong. Eli had warned Lila about this season, how thunderstorms rolled through without rain, just light and fury. Leaving trouble behind, that afternoon, the clouds came in fast. A wall of bruised purple stacked high over the western ridge, rumbling low like an angry drum. By sundown, heat lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the ridgeline in sudden white cuts. Lila stepped out onto the porch, arms folded. Feels strange, she murmured. Eli joined her, jaw tight. That's dry lightning. Nothing good comes from it. A sharp crack split the air closer this time. A second followed, then a pause, and then they saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of Horse Creek Ridge, dark and twisting, growing even as they watched. Eli swore under his breath. That's near the boundary fence. Within minutes, they heard pounding hooves. A rider from the Kincaid Ranch came tearing down the road, horse lathered, eyes wide. Fire on the ridge, he yelled, barely pulling up in time. Kincaid's crew is short-handed. We need every able body. Fire don't care whose land it burns. Eli didn't waste a second. He grabbed his saddle, cinched it tight. Lila ran to fetch the water buckets, grabbing wet rags and a small shovel. You're staying here, Eli started, but Lila shook her head sharply. I can haul water. I can drive stock. I won't sit while your land burns. He hesitated. She stared back. Steady. Finally. He nodded. Stay close to me. No heroics. They rode hard. The closer they got to the ridge, the thicker the smoke grew, stinging the eyes, coating the tongue, turning the sky a sickly red. The smell of burning sage and dry grass filled the air. By the time they crested the low rise near the boundary line, flames were already licking across the hillside, moving fast with the wind. A half-dozen of Kincaid's men were there, beating at the flames with wet sacks, digging trenches to stop the fire's crawl. The soldiers from the outpost had arrived too, uniforms streaked with soot. Shouts cut through the crackle of flames. Eli jumped off his horse and plunged into the work. Leela followed, coughing as smoke swirled around her. The heat hit like opening an oven door. It sucked breath from the lungs. Quickly, they fell into a rhythm, hauling water from a nearby trough, dousing grass, slapping at flames that tried to leap the trench. Every time Lila stumbled, Eli was there to steady her. Every time he turned away, she was already hauling another bucket toward the burning brush. At the far side of the ridge, a small bunch of cattle bawled in terror, pushing dangerously close to a burning draw. Leela spotted them and tugged on Eli's sleeve. If they fall into that, she said, coughing. We lose them all. Go, Eli said. Push 'em east. I'll hold the line here. She mounted the roan and rode fast around the draw, waving her arms, calling out, pushing the animals back toward safer ground. Sparks flew around her like angry fireflies. Smoke streaked her face black. Sweat cut pale lines down her cheeks. On the ridge above her, a horse screamed a panicked, sudden cry. Eli's. She whipped her head up just in time to see Eli's mount stumble over a burned log. Horse and rider went down hard. Eli rolled, landing too close to a swirl of flame kicked up by the shifting wind. Eli, Lila shouted, driving the roan hard uphill. He struggled to rise, but pain shot through his leg, dropping him to one knee. The fire swerved unpredictably, drawn by the gusts that swept across the ridge. Flames leapt toward him like something alive. He tried to crawl backward, coughing violently. Lila didn't think, she simply acted. She rode straight into the heat, eyes watering, lungs burning. She reached Eli as the flames curled dangerously near. Sliding from the saddle, she grabbed him under the arms. Up, she gasped. I can stand, he started, but she wasn't having it. You can't, she snapped. Move with a strength that surprised them both. She heaved him sideways across her saddle, gripping the reins with one hand and Eli's belt with the other. The roan reared at the heat, but obeyed, backing away from the fire. Flames roared behind them. Smoke swallowed the sky. When they reached safer ground, Lila nearly collapsed. Panting hard, Eli slid off the horse, wincing as he tested his leg. A deep wrench, but not broken. He looked up at Lila, hair wild. face streaked with ash, hands shaking from adrenaline, and something in his eyes softened in a way she'd never seen. "Lila, you saved my life." Before she could answer, another figure appeared through the smoke. Boyd Kincaid. He stared at Eli, then at Lila, taking in the soot, the closeness between them, the mark of danger still clinging to their clothes. His gaze shifted just for a second from confusion to something like respect, then curdled into something sharper, jealousy, a bitterness he couldn't hide. Lila held his gaze, not defiant, not afraid, just steady. Kincaid turned away first. The fire raged on behind them, but the air between the three of them felt hotter still, charged with something deeper, heavier, inevitable. The smoke had finally begun to thin over Horse Creek Ridge, leaving behind a broad swath of charred earth. Day by day, the prairie winds carried away the last hints of fire, though the smell of burnt sage still clung to the air like a memory that refused to loosen its grip. Eli moved slowly around the yard, testing his injured leg as he worked. The wrench hadn't broken bone, but it left him stiff and sore. Lila did the heavy lifting, now hauling buckets, tending the horses, splitting kindling with a methodical rhythm that surprised them both. There was a new steadiness in her since the letter. A quiet backbone, a sense that the ground beneath her feet finally belonged to her as much as anyone. That morning, the sun had barely cleared the horizon when dust kicked up on the road. A small rider cloud approached, moving with determination. Eli shaded his eyes. Kincaid. He muttered. Two of Boyd's ranch hands flanked him, riding stiff in the saddle like men summoned to witness something unpleasant. Kincaid pulled up at the gate, eyes narrow, posture sharp. Eli stepped outside, jaw set, though his limp made the movement uneven. "Morning?" Eli said coolly. Kincaid didn't bother with pleasantries. "We've got business." Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lila stepped out of the cabin behind him, skirts brushing the doorway, spine straight as a fence post. She took her place at Eli's shoulder, not behind him. Her presence unsettled Kincaid more than Eli's whole stance. Boyd cleared his throat. "Miss Hart, I've come on a matter of law." He lifted a crumpled paper from his coat. "Your mail order contract names me as your intended. You were promised to my household. This man," he pointed sharply at Eli, "has interfered with a lawful arrangement." One of his ranch hands shifted in the saddle. Clearly uncomfortable, Lila's expression didn't flinch. She held something in her hands, a neat, ribbon-tied bundle. Eli recognized it, her letters. "All of them," Kincaid continued, voice rising. "If need be, I'll bring the county judge into this, or the army garrison. You can't just walk off with another man's contractual bride." Eli opened his mouth, but Lila touched his arm lightly, just 2 fingers. But the meaning was clear. "Let me—" She stepped forward. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, voice steady, though the moment quivered with weight. "If you've come to claim me as property, then you should hear your own words first." She untied the ribbon and pulled out the advertisement Kincaid had posted nearly a year ago. She read aloud, seeking a willing partner, of sound character, to share my home and prospects. Mutual respect, a must. A murmur rippled across the road. Folks had begun wandering near the blacksmith on his way to the forge. Mrs. Dalton heading into town. Even a young army lieutenant riding past paused his horse to listen. Lila lifted the next page, one of Kincaid's earlier letters. It was stiff, practical, impersonal. "You wrote of chores," she said, of the rooms in your house, of what you expected of me. She turned a page. Never once did you ask who I was. Kincaid's jaw tightened. Irrelevant. The agreement, it is relevant, Lila interrupted softly. Because the moment you saw me at your own gate, you revoked that agreement. She withdrew the paper he had shoved into her hands that awful day, the rejection letter, the one he thought would stay buried in the dust. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver, either. You wrote, she read, that my appearance was not as described, that my past was unsuitable for a man of your standing. You offered to refund my fare, but not my dignity. A few townsfolk exchanged troubled glances. Someone muttered, shameful. Kincaid flushed red. That was my right. A man has a right to send back a woman like a defective shipment, Lila asked, eyes sharp but calm. Is that the right you're defending today? The words struck harder than shouting ever could. She stepped closer to him, holding the letter out. You broke your word at your own gate. Mr. Kincaid, you sent me away, whatever contract you think you had. She let the silence hang a moment. You burned it that day. Eli watched her with quiet pride, no need to interfere. She didn't shrink, didn't fold. She stood her height. And for the first time, Kincaid seemed small in comparison. Around them, the audience grew ranchers who'd fought the fire beside Eli and Lila, Mr. Dalton with a sack of mail under his arm, and the young army lieutenant whose horse stamped impatiently, but whose eyes didn't leave the confrontation. Lila held the rejection letter between her fingertips. Then, slowly, deliberately, she tore it in half. The sound of paper ripping felt louder than thunder. She let the two pieces fall into the dust at Boyd Kincaid's boots. Eli stepped forward, his limp not diminishing the steel in his voice. You don't own her, Boyd, he said, and you never did. Kincaid looked around him at the witnesses, at the letter scraps in the dirt, at the woman he'd once dismissed without a thought, now standing tall in the light of morning. His pride wavered, his authority slipped. He felt it, and so did everyone watching. He jerked the reins and spat a sharp curse. This isn't finished, he snarled, but he didn't press the claim. With too many eyes on him, he couldn't, not without losing more ground. He wheeled his horse around, fury stiffening his posture, and rode off, his two ranch hands trailing uneasily behind him. Dust rose in their wake. Leela didn't watch him go. She just exhaled, long and slow, as if releasing the last breath of a chapter she'd carried for far too long. Eli looked at her, not with pity, with something deeper. And though the danger had passed for now, there was a tremor under the ground, something unfinished, unresolved. The pieces of the torn letter fluttered once in the wind, before settling back into the dust. The days after Kincaid's visit settled into a strange, fragile quiet, the kind that comes after a hard storm when the air still smells like smoke, and the world waits to see what grows back and what stays burned. Lila moved through the days with a steadiness that surprised even her. She cooked, rode fence with Eli, tended the small garden she'd coaxed from tired ground. But something inside her was shifting slow, but sure like a wheel beginning to turn after a long rust. One afternoon, while delivering a basket of bread to the army outpost, she overheard the chaplain's wife talking to the quartermaster. Miss Avery's leaving, the woman said. Her family wrote they want her back east. We'll need someone to teach. Soldiers' children, a few local youngsters, someone patient, steady. The chaplain's wife saw Lila in the doorway and smiled warmly. You read, don't you, Miss Hart? A fair bit. Lila answered slowly. We could use a woman like that. The words stayed with her the whole walk home. That night, she watched the light fade across the prairie. Eli working on the porch steps below. A teacher, a room full of children, a life that didn't depend on a man's name or protection. Independent. Earned. Hers. She imagined it the way you imagine touching the edge of a warm lamp after years in the cold. Eli noticed something in her expression, something thoughtful, restless. He didn't ask. Instead, he grew quieter over the next few days, rationed his words, stayed longer out on the back pasture, came in late, dust streaked on his collar, his face drawn like he was holding something too tightly. He didn't want to be another man deciding her future. She could see that in the way he avoided her eyes when she asked simple questions. The night she inquired privately with the stagecoach driver about the next route east, about the cost, about the room for a trunk, she felt like she was standing outside her own body. The driver wrote her name down. Plenty of seats, day after tomorrow, he said. Leaving at dawn. Just in case, she told herself. Just in case. Eli didn't know. But he sensed something shifting in the air between them like the faint tremor before a bridge gives way. On the evening before the stage was set to leave, they sat together on the porch. A pot of coffee between them, the stars sharp as pinpricks overhead, the cricket song rising slow from the creek bed. Eli sipped once, then set his cup down. Leela curled both hands around hers for warmth. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It wasn't light either. It was something in between, like a book held open to a page no one wanted to turn. You've been quiet, she said at last. He nodded. You too. She traced the rim of her cup, just thinking. About what a future. The words hung a moment, weighty and soft at the same time. Eli swallowed hard. I figured. She looked sideways at him. His face was turned toward the horizon, toward the faint outline of Red Creek's lamplights in the distance. But she could see tension in his jaw, the kind of tension that comes from holding back. He didn't say more. Neither did she. The night passed slowly, a little wind, a few falling stars, nothing resolved. By dawn, the sky held a faint purple glow. Lila's trunk sat by the door, neatly packed. She smoothed her dress, tied her bonnet, took one last look at the cabin, the table she'd scrubbed, the books she'd dusted, the windows she'd opened to let the world breathe again. Eli brought the wagon around, face unreadable. He loaded her trunk without a word. The whole ride to town was wrapped in silence. Not cold, not angry, just aching. The road dipped through cottonwoods and long grass. Morning birds called. Lila watched the land she'd begun to love slowly, reluctantly passing by on either side. Eli kept his eyes straight ahead, hands steady on the reins, the muscle in his cheek working from time to time, like he was biting back words. When they reached the depot, the stagecoach was already waiting. Steam puffed from the horses' noses. Travelers shifted with early morning stiffness. Mr. Dalton waved from a distance. Leela climbed down quietly. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Eli took her trunk and set it beside the coach steps. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't try to pull her close. He just stood there, hat low, eyes shadowed. She stepped toward the stage's open door, one foot already on the step. That's when Eli finally spoke. If you go, he said, voice rough from holding back too long, I'll wish you well every mile. She froze. He exhaled slowly, like pulling words from a deep, stubborn place. But I need you to know something first. Lila turned. The rising sun slid across his face, lighting the hurt, the hope, the fear, all of it tangled together. This place isn't just mine anymore, he said. A pause, breath taken, not quite released. Somewhere along the way, it started feeling like ours. Her hand tightened on the coach doorframe. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a demand. It was just the truth laid bare in the morning light. Drivers called last boarding, horses stomped, dust swirled at their feet. The world waited on her next breath, last call, all aboard. The driver's voice carried across the depot yard, bouncing off the freight shed and the telegraph post. Lila stood with one foot on the stagecoach step, the morning light brushing the side of her face. Her trunk waited to be loaded. Her ticket sat folded in her glove. In front of her lay the long road east towns she'd never seen. Classrooms filled with soldiers' children, a new name she might carve for herself far away from gossip and flame-scorched hills. Behind her stood Eli Mercer, hat in his hands, dust on his boots, eyes steady, but bruised with a sadness he wasn't trying to hide. He didn't call her name, didn't reach for her, just waited like a man who'd learned the hard way never to take someone's freedom out of their hands. Leela's breath quivered. The horse team stamped impatiently. Travelers climbed aboard, murmuring to each other. It would be so easy to step forward, to vanish down the long, straight road, until Eli and Red Creek faded into memory. But when she looked at the horizon, she saw only distance. When she looked at Eli, she saw home. Slowly, she stepped back, down from the coach. Her boots touched the dirt with a soft thud. Eli's shoulders tensed, hope flickering, but held tight. But she walked toward him until they stood just a few feet apart. The dust swirled around them in the cool morning breeze. I came west to be someone's property, she said quietly. Eli swallowed, his hands tightening on the brim of his hat. Leela's voice softened. I think I'd rather stay and be someone's partner. The breath Eli let out then wasn't loud, but it was deep like a man finally putting down a weight he'd been carrying too long. He didn't touch her, not yet. He just nodded, slow and reverent. Then, let's go home, he murmured. She smiled, small, warm, certain. They left the stage behind them and walked to the wagon side by side. The cottonwoods had shed most of their leaves, leaving gold scattered across the churchyard like old coins. The chapel was simple pine boards, white paint peeling a bit on the north side, but it felt right. Inside, friends gathered, not many, but enough to fill the small space with warmth. Mary Ellen offered Lila a small bouquet of prairie asters. Mr. Dalton straightened Eli's collar. The blacksmith and his wife whispered about how handsome Eli looked, shaved clean for once. Two soldiers in crisp uniforms stood near the back, hats in hand. The preacher cleared his throat, his voice soft over the rustle of skirts. Marriage, he said, isn't about one life claiming another. It's about two folks deciding to carry what they can and lighten what the other can't. Lila's hands trembled only once when Eli took them in his own. No lace, no choir, no grand procession, just a promise, spoken low, warm, and true, when it was done. When he kissed her gentle, careful, as if afraid to break the moment the congregation let out a breath, like they'd all been holding it together. Outside, the wind carried the smell of late harvest and distant snow. Lila tucked her arm through Eli's, and the world felt steady. Winter crept close, and the cabin had grown to meet it, an extra room framed with new timber, a sturdier roofline, fresh chinking between the logs, jars of preserves lined a shelf like Jewel's blackberry, chokecherry, wild plum. Lila's garden beds lay sleeping under straw, waiting for spring. Inside, Eli sat at the table, smoothing a folded paper the deed. He signed his name, then passed the pen. Lila added hers beside it. L. Hart Mercer. The ink glistened, dark and sure. Eli watched her hand, pride softening his face. "This place looks different," he said. "It breathes easier," she replied. They shared a smile that needed no words. One afternoon, while repairing the south corral, Eli heard the distant rattle of wheels. A wagon approached slowly along Kincaid Road, same dust, same long shadows as the day Lila first arrived in his life. But this time, something else stood at the famous gate, a boy no older than 12, clothes torn, a small bundle at his feet, eyes wide with the hollow look of someone turned away one too many times. From the porch, Lila saw him too. Her breath caught. The wagon that carried him moved on without him, left him standing alone in front of the grand Kincaid sign, just like she'd once stood. Eli walked up beside her. "He's been turned out," Lila whispered. "Just a child." They stood there in the quiet, remembering the sting of rejection, the long road that had led them to this gentler life. Eli touched the brim of his hat and gave her a sideways look, half tenderness, half quiet conviction. "Gates open down here," he said softly. "If he wants it." Lila's hand slipped into his, warm and sure. They walked together toward the lonely figure, two people who knew what it meant to have nowhere to go, and what it meant when someone finally said, "Stay." Because the story that began with a woman abandoned at a gate ended with a couple who refused to leave another soul stranded. Not out of charity. Not out of duty, but because love, real love, builds a home wide enough for someone else to stand in. And on that dusty stretch of Dakota land, with winter pressing close and hope stirring like a small fire, Eli and Lila Mercer open their gate and their hearts for good. Sometimes healing begins where we least expect it, not in a church pew or a doctor's hands, but at a lonely gate where two wounded lives cross paths. Lila came west, believing she had been judged forever. Eli lived, believing some losses were simply meant to stay empty. But the truth is quieter than all that. Sometimes, all a person needs is a place where they're not talked over, not defined by old stories, just seen, the way they are, in the light of an ordinary day. And maybe that's the real miracle this land gives us. Not grand rescues, not perfect endings, just two people choosing kindness in a world that doesn't offer much of it. Their love didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived like sunrise. Slow, steady, patient, something you don't notice until one morning you realize the dark has lifted. And in the end, the home they built wasn't just for themselves. It was for anyone left stranded on a hard road, looking for a gate that might finally open. If this touched your heart, thank you for listening, and may you always find a place where you're welcomed in. Thank you for being here with us, for every minute you spent listening, for every breath you shared with this story. We're grateful. Out here on Wild West Echoes, we try to keep the small lights burning, those quiet tales of kindness, dignity, and second chances that so often get lost in the dust of history. Every like, every share, every subscribe, it isn't just a button. It's a way of saying these stories matter. It's a way of helping us carry them a little farther down the trail. Thank you for walking with us. And until the next story, may your road be gentle and your heart stay open.